Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. The debate over legalizing recreational marijuana in Pennsylvania is heating up. But what should Christians think about it? With an impending budget deficit and pre-existing bipartisan support, the state legislature faces increased pressures to generate revenue through legalizing recreational marijuana and flooding every street corner with pot shops. Amid this political momentum, Christians have questions. Can Christians use marijuana? Does the Bible speak about the issue? What are the medical, legal, familial, and societal implications of recreational legalization? To foster informed citizens and address this critical social issue from a distinctly Christian perspective, the Institute for Faith and Freedom is thrilled to welcome Dan Bartkowiak for tonight's lecture entitled Truth on Weed, a Christian Response to Marijuana Legalization. Dan Bartkowiak has served over 17 years on the staff of Pennsylvania Family Institute, a leading pro-life, pro-family nonprofit organization based in Harrisburg. You can find PA Family at pafamily.org. Dan currently serves as PA Family's Chief Strategy Officer and is a spokesperson for the organization on numerous issues, including the Pennsylvania March for Life and their Truth on Weed initiative. A 2007 graduate of Grove City College, Dan and his wife Bethany, also a 2007 grad of Grove City College, are parents of 4 children. Please join me in welcoming Dan Bartkowiak.
All right. Good evening. Well, first and foremost, thank you to the Institute for Faith and Freedom, Grove City College, for hosting this discussion. It's been nearly 2 decades since I graduated. I can remember sitting about right there for a few classes, but it has been some time, and I think fondly back at my time here at Grove City. And in the position that I'm in here is very much because of a lot of the doors that were opened from Grove City College, so I have much to be thankful for. I give a shout out to Jake Reese introducing me. We spent a summer together as an intern at Pennsylvania Family Institute. He did a great job. We do a youth leadership conference over the summer for high school students and just a variety of projects. So I bring that up. We do internships at our organization, nonprofit organization based in Harrisburg. And whether you're interested in public policy, interested in law, we have an independence law center that has a variety of attorneys. One, Lauren Hackett, that's actually from here at Grove City, that we engage on a variety of topics that we welcome the help of our interns. So certainly see me if you are interested in pursuing something like that over the summer. Truth on weed. I have to admit that seeing posters around campus of the marijuana plant, that was not on my bingo card when I, thinking back as a student. I very much appreciate the opportunity at Pennsylvania Family Institute that I've been there, and there's a variety of engaging topics. And the last few legislative sessions, this has been one of them. And so I've delved into this as an organization that we look to protect families, we look to strengthen families. The mission of the organization is to see Pennsylvania as a state where God is honored, religious freedom flourishes, families thrive, and life is cherished. And we are one of about 40 family policy councils from around the country that are state-based but work to advance a variety of those beliefs. And we certainly feel like one, with the onset of this type of commercialization with marijuana, there is something we want to weigh in, looking to protect families. But what I want to show is, often with this issue, we might think, with the marijuana plant, you kind of look at that. And really what should come to mind is this. You've got cartoon mascots. You've got where, 420 marijuana out in Colorado, pointing at there's more pot shops than Starbucks and McDonald's combined. It's easier to find a bag of weed than it is a Starbucks latte. You have a pumpkin carving contest using Disney characters. This is commercialization. The state getting involved in profiting from more use of this drug. This is what really should come to mind. And in our time this evening, there's 3 main points that I want to cover. One is first just defining some of the terms when it comes to marijuana legalization, and especially from the policy perspective, particularly when it comes to what we've known as recreational use. The second is assessing some of the potential harms with regards to marijuana legalization. And then thirdly, to address what a Christian response to marijuana use and legalization, what that might look like. So I work in Harrisburg. My office is just a couple blocks away from the Capitol. So I'm often going over during legislative session, connecting with state representatives, state senators. And what some state lawmakers that are pushing for the marijuana legalization efforts, what I've heard at the Capitol are, one state rep saying, we know that cannabis is as close to harmless as it gets. Former Governor Tom Wolf has said he doesn't understand how anyone could think marijuana is addictive. Another state representative that is currently in leadership in Pennsylvania, and I can remember he said this at a rally. He said, we know cannabis is not dangerous. We know cannabis is not addictive. The only thing at risk with legalization are potato chips, to elude some laughter because of alluding to the munchies when you use marijuana. And to me, this issue is no laughing matter. And those types of statements by some of these lawmakers, frankly, is showing an archaic view of marijuana legalization and not what today's marijuana is all about. So when we talk marijuana legalization, it's often a term that's used very broadly. Some argue that right now in Pennsylvania we should legalize marijuana. Governor Shapiro last budget session said we need to legalize marijuana. I would argue we have legalized marijuana. We have a medical program right now in Pennsylvania that frankly needs a lot of fixing. But there is the ability to access marijuana from a legal standpoint here in our state. I think something that's helpful is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, has put marijuana into 4 distinct legal categories, which I believe are critical distinctions when it comes to this discussion. And those 4 categories are medical, what they say is non-medical, the second, often kind of used as recreational, the third being decriminalization, and 4 being illegal. 4 categories for really legalization. Again, I would argue our medical program here in Pennsylvania, and I know there might be students from different states, there's different, obviously, policy that's going on in states, but here in Pennsylvania, the medical program, I believe, needs fixing. Oftentimes when I have this discussion, there's a thought that doctors are prescribing specific dosage of marijuana products. And what we're seeing is there are medical professionals, a handful that are rubber stamping thousands and thousands of medical cards to then just release folks to go into a dispensary and they can buy whatever they want. I would submit that that's not seeking out that medical help for that patient. And I think there can be an enhancing of that program. And I think there's other issues with that. Also, when it comes to the topic of decriminalization, it's often used in the kind of bucket, so to speak, of the recreational use. We can make changes, I would submit, and improvements to our criminal justice system without having to commercialize and look to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. So I think these distinctions are important. And when we have the discussion about this, and a lot of my talk here is focusing on what Pennsylvania and some states are looking at with regards to recreational use, but all 4 of these are kind of distinct buckets that really we should be talking about. Another term that I want to just address briefly is potency. THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, the psychoactive component in marijuana that brings the high, the delta 9. I know there's other variants, delta 8, kratom, that is certainly some areas that need to be discussed. For tonight, it's kind of focused on that delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, that is causing a variety of the psychoactive components, the primary kind of concern that I would present. 20 years ago, I was a student here at Grove City. I was a sophomore 20 years ago here. And THC in marijuana at that time was single digits. Low count, 3%, maybe 5% THC. Vaping marijuana wasn't around. Vaping cartridges weren't invented yet. So you look at today, the dry flower smoking marijuana, it's now between 20, 30% THC. And you have manufactured flavored concentrates, edibles, 60, 70, 80, 90% THC. Modern marijuana legalization means industrialized, genetically engineered, high potency THC products being marketed, sold for retail consumption in local communities. And it's, again, that picture that I showed before. That's what we're seeing in so many of these states. Washington State was one of the first to legalize marijuana for recreational use. Oftentimes we point at Colorado. Washington State was also at the same time. And their state government recently, a few years ago, commissioned a study to be done on their program and particularly looked at the potency of their products. And here's what the head of the organization had to say of that study. Highly potent manufactured cannabis products are available in retail stores with THC content varying from 60 to 90%. They don't resemble the plant. They are as close to the cannabis plant as strawberries are to frosted strawberry Pop-Tarts. Manufactured cannabis extracts now represent 35% of the Washington cannabis market, up from 9% in 2014. And that statement was back in 2020. So it's already been 5 years. The extracts and concentrates are a rising part of the market. I'd also point in the New York Times, a more recent article, a few months ago, they published an article entitled, "As America's Marijuana Use Grows, So Do the Risks." potency problems are addressed. And here's what they said. Lawmakers and voters began legalizing medical marijuana state by state in the 1990s. The commercial industry that followed touted its products as beneficial, while focusing not on developing marijuana's medical use, but on engineering a quicker, more intense high. The marijuana smoked in the 1990s, typically containing about 5% THC, was transformed. Companies turned out inconspicuous vape pens, fast-acting edibles, pre-rolled joints, infused with potency enhancers and concentrates, which is with as much as 99% THC. There's one state rep out in Washington State, a Democrat, who told the Washington Times, the cannabis that's sold today is an entirely different drug than the cannabis plants that voters legalized in 2012. When you have a different drug, you have different health impacts. So now we're starting to get into the harms of legalization. And an important question certainly to ask is, what is the impact of marijuana commercialization? You know, what we're seeing, especially the higher levels of THC, is commercialization leading to higher rates of dependency and addiction. Yes, you can be addicted to marijuana, and ultimately more problems. The Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University a number of years ago commissioned a study to better understand the economic and social costs of legalizing marijuana. While much has been written about the tax revenue and total sales generated from commercial marijuana, there has been little research to understand how Coloradans are paying to mitigate the consequences of commercial marijuana. And I'd say here in Pennsylvania, that's often. We've heard a lot of projections of what money we might be able to bring from tax revenue. There hasn't been a whole lot of talk of the costs, and it needs to be addressed. In Colorado, the study, they found $4.50 in cost every dollar in marijuana tax revenue. You know, the report, it was a great first step in addressing the breadth of costs associated with marijuana commercialization. Dr. Tom Copeland, he's the former research director for the Centennial Institute, and he pointed out for Pennsylvania, any short-term revenue increase will be swallowed up by the serious long-term social and economic effects of legalization. And I think it's important to highlight, there's areas, healthcare, crime, traffic, housing, when it comes to homelessness. There's a variety of areas that have been impacted in states experimenting with marijuana legalization. So here in Pennsylvania, the latest talk has certainly been with regards to Governor Josh Shapiro's budget address, where he called for commercializing marijuana, called for a 20% tax, which would be one of the higher tax rates of states experimenting with legalization. And I thought it was interesting, Governor Shapiro admitted his changed view on this. He pointed at his previous reservations being a father of four and Pennsylvania's former chief law enforcement officer. He claimed that after internal study that those concerns were alleviated. And I would argue that what we've seen with marijuana legalization, concerns with the impact on youth and law enforcement, public health and safety, those concerns have not been alleviated. And in recent years, frankly, commercialization's only made it worse. So as the Centennial Institute found, there are a variety of costs. Tonight, and certainly we can have some time in the Q&A, I'm going to focus on those reservations that Governor Shapiro had, the impact on youth and law enforcement. So first young adults. In 2023, Temple University published a study that identified increased youth use of marijuana in states experimenting with recreational legalization. They found the experiment, quote, is associated with risk factors for cannabis use disorder, including easier access to cannabis, stronger cannabis potency, greater varieties of cannabis products, and exposure to cannabis advertising and sales. So cannabis use disorder, it's the medical term now used for the levels of addiction. On Valentine's Day just last week, there was an article in the Psychology Today by Dr. Mark Gold. And the article was titled Calls to Reassess Cannabis Risks, in which he identified how cannabis use disorder is rapidly growing as an addiction here in the United States. His key points were how recent publications have highlighted numerous problems that are consequences of marijuana use and related depression, emergency room visits, suicide, and addiction risks that are now in focus. I'd say if you have just watched the news recently, there are more and more stories that are coming out that are highlighting the impact, particularly on high potency marijuana. So I want to highlight, there's sadly too many families that are being impacted by this, and there are a few that are highlighted in this video clip. So let's take a look.
I've been 42 years. I go to 12-step meetings for every day, and so I hear stories all the time of people, of the impacts of marijuana on people, and really catastrophic impacts on them.
A judge ruled a 32-year-old California woman did not need to serve prison time for stabbing her boyfriend to death during what prosecutors called a cannabis-induced psychosis.
It took 7 police officers tasing Brand 4 times, hitting her with a metal baton 9 times, and finally breaking her right arm to get the knife from her hand.
Someone's life was taken with my hands.
With higher potency marijuana products, they actually produce a greater level of change in dopamine and glutamate, 2 very important neurotransmitters or chemicals that the brain uses for normal balance. And you're creating an exaggerated psychiatric response, which could be as basic as anxiety and fear, or go out as far as hallucinations and psychosis.
We're seeing depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, schizophrenia even, and schizophrenia in particular is one of those more notable psychiatric disorders that we're seeing more and more on the rise.
We're definitely seeing psychosis for those who are using cannabis products. We're seeing it at higher rates than ever.
I have a son who started smoking marijuana in the 8th grade. At age 18, he had his first psychotic break. Everywhere he went, this product was available and in greater and greater concentrations and potency.
Kristen happens to be a neuroscientist and now believes smoking weed led to her son's psychotic bouts and triggered his eventual schizophrenia. Anders started self-medicating with other drugs to quiet the voices and died from an overdose when he was 22.
I knew something was wrong. If he had never started using cannabis, he might still be here.
I know marijuana was the reason that our son died. He was in cannabis-induced psychosis, and he had a lot of the characteristics and symptoms that people have when they're in that. He was paranoid, he was delusional.
My son, Johnny Stack, sadly died by suicide at the age of 19 after becoming psychotic from using high THC marijuana concentrates and vapes.
Research is using terminology like rapid addiction potential for these higher potent drugs. The research says about 30% of users will become addicted to cannabis products.
Today he has schizoaffective disorder with co-occurring substance misuse, and he will never recover. And our family is broken as a result, and we will never be made whole.
It's sobering to just hear, these moms just heartbroken. There's 2 things I want to highlight, just some stories of my experiences over the last few years on this topic, and I've given different debate talks and whatnot, and there was one for the PA Cable Network, and I brought up several of what we see of the mental health problems, some of the impact that we're seeing, particularly with high potency. And there was somebody with the marijuana industry that was on the other side, kind of the debate, and he literally just rolled his eyes at me and he said it's completely false. You can't roll your eyes at these parents. You can't roll your eyes at what this evidence that we're seeing, particularly with the high potency and impact. It's very real, and it's, again, understanding what today's version of marijuana is doing. It's not the Woodstock weed. It's not from the 80s, 90s. This is very different, and it's impacting families in very different ways. The other story I'd say is I was on a debate, and on my side was Kate Appleman. She is the director of men's treatment for Caron Treatment Centers, which is based in Pennsylvania. And she was asked, is marijuana a gateway drug? It's kind of a common question that comes up. She was very quick to point out Let me say that marijuana is very harmful in and of itself. Oftentimes we think it leads to others. What I'm seeing is this is very harmful. She has seen what used to be rare is now common. Patients coming into their facility that are addicted to marijuana. Teens coming in, it's the top drug that is being used, sometimes solely for being entered into their treatment facilities. So again, this is what we're seeing today. Those that are in treatments, those that are in healthcare, they're seeing the impacts of particularly high potency marijuana. According to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, in the last 20 years, marijuana use, generally they kind of looked at it from past month, has doubled and daily use has quadrupled. Some of the surveys that we use, I'll say it again, marijuana use has doubled and daily use has quadrupled. Daily is often kind of the indicator for an addiction. So and that's for ages 12 and up. What has changed in the last 20 years is the commercialization of marijuana. I don't want a state like Pennsylvania having more pot shops than Starbucks and McDonald's combined, and that's what we see in states like Colorado. Going back to the Temple study, along with marijuana and mental health issues, it found easier access as a problem. Every state experimenting with legalization says sales are for age 21 and up. You have an impact on a younger generation. The more increased access, the more problems you're going to have. The largest school district in Detroit, the superintendent there is Dr. Nikolai Vitti, wrote a letter to the governor talking about how school day-to-day operations are being significantly disrupted, saying that he points out since marijuana legalization for recreational use in the state of Michigan, there has been a distressing escalation in marijuana-related infractions. From 2019 to 2021, they saw a number 289 drug infractions. Between 2021 and 2023, it was nearly 1,800. In 2024, for the first 4 months, it was 745. It's worth noting, too, that the evidence that we see in some of these states experimenting with legalization, reporting seeing marijuana billboards more than once a day, students were 4 times more likely to have used marijuana in the past year and 7 times more likely to have used in the past month. I'll point, health organizations like Christian Medical and Dental Association have weighed in, opposing efforts to legalize marijuana for non-medical use, for recreational purposes. They say recreational marijuana use and legalization have profound social implications, including associated increases in the following: accidents and death, access to marijuana for minors, crime, drug abuse, black market activity, and environmental problems. The cost to society of recreational marijuana legalization is greater than tax revenues produced from its sales. Another voice for legalization is AAA. They state cannabis can impair a person's ability to drive safely, and emerging research on the effects of liberalizing cannabis use portends negative implications for traffic safety. Now we're getting into some of the law enforcement efforts, and one thing we're starting to see a lot of solid evidence in these states is the marijuana legalization leading to more traffic crimes and fatalities. One group found that 1,400 more traffic deaths per year in states that legalize weed. If we look at some of the data, it can translate in Pennsylvania to 40 more fatal crashes and over 1,000 accidents annually. The National Safety Council points out intoxicating cannabis products, including marijuana, can have a major impact on safety at work and have been proven to slow reaction time, impact memory, and impair skills essential to driving. State legalization of the drug creates new challenges for employers. The collective voice, and the more I talk with law enforcement, the more I understand the need to push back on legalization. The collective voice is opposed to marijuana legalization. The Fraternal Order of Police here in the state. Marijuana is a dangerous drug that poses real threats to public safety and public health, and strongly opposes any efforts for legalization at the state or local level. In my conversation, the common thread with law enforcement, I have family that is in law enforcement here, and from Scott Bond, the PA Chiefs of Police Association, head of it, have often said, pointing at there's still no recommended dosage or level of impairment when it comes to marijuana that can be easily measured. It's a judgment call oftentimes for law enforcement. I recently read a headline, even outside of traffic fatalities. Denver The heads of restaurants in downtown are pointing to how Denver's falling apart. They're pleading with their mayor to fix everything, and they're saying it's not a homeless problem, it's an addiction problem. Luke Niferatos is with Smart Approaches to Marijuana. They're one of the national organizations that are investing research and really exposing the harms of marijuana legalization. He lives in Colorado. He's a good friend. He's a Christian. And he calls out how Denver is really kind of facing the problem. It's because they have an addiction problem. The legalizing addiction drugs has consequences. And I'd add, too, when it comes to Colorado, right now they have legalized magic mushrooms. It's kind of where do you draw the line with regards to drug legalization? The state of Oregon tried that, and it was a disaster to decriminalize all drugs. Where's the line when it comes to using marijuana, and especially the high potencies that we see today? Today's marijuana, it's harmful, it can be addictive, and legalization for retail recreational use, I submit, would make it worse. A lot has changed in 20 years, as I point to my time, in college. But another observation, and this is the third point that I want to draw attention to when it comes to a Christian response. Really, if you look at the church 20 years ago, there really wasn't a need to address the issue. It was simply kind of pointing to the legal status. It's wrong because it's illegal. I appreciate some like John Piper, who has put it this way. If the state has regarded something as wrong or illegal, then the church hasn't had to work very hard to teach any deep roots for the conviction or any thorough biblical argumentation or any conviction strengthening inspiration, because everybody just assumes that the behavior is out of bounds. While an argument can be made that marijuana is illegal on the federal side, so we should oppose because we should adhere to federal law, we are seeing states that are experimenting with legalization. And there can be certainly a deep, thorough examination from a Christian that looks at opposition for marijuana use and its legalization. Again, I draw attention to the Christian Medical and Dental Association. Society should not condone harmful behaviors, including the promotion and use of hallucinogenics, potentially addicting drugs like marijuana. Scripture cautions us to not be mastered by anything in 1 Corinthians. For when anything or person other than God is master, we are guilty of idolatry. Looking at Deuteronomy. In not loving God with all of our heart, mind, body, and soul. Looking at the Gospel of Mark. You don't need to have deep theological analysis on this issue. And while I did minor in Christian thought here at Grove City College, I would like to point to a few scholars on what they say, their observations of Scripture, and looking at the issue of marijuana. So I have another video here to share.
And furthermore, so the first thing to realize is there's nothing wrong or evil with the marijuana plant itself. It's a part of God's good creation. The important issue is not the moral status of the cannabis plant. The real issue is how we use it or how we abuse it.
When we delve into the pages of Scripture, we are confronted with a resounding message about the significance of sobriety and the perils of intoxication, which alters our mental state.
The Scripture just routinely, throughout, pervasively, condemns intoxication.
The body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Your body is sacred. God is for your body. Your body is for the Lord. 1 Corinthians 6:13.
There is nothing in Scripture to justify trying to escape reality. The Bible dignifies reality. It does not dignify an altered state.
Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6:12 that even though some things are legal or lawful, that all things are not expedient. They're not, for our benefit. And, when you think about, what it does as far as, the alteration of our mind and all the emphasis that the Bible puts on being sober, Peter in 1 Peter, he speaks 3 times, be sober, be sober, be sober. And that means, to be, in your right mind and not be controlled by some substance.
Drug use will impair one's ability to determine what is morally right and pleasing to God.
Keep your mind clear and able to think, because Paul said, be babes in evil, but in your thinking, be mature, that is, be sharp, be on top of it. And the root of that is that God gave us minds to know Him. and he gave us hearts to love him.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it tells us that we are to give everything to God. Marijuana use as an escape can bring us further away from relying upon and trusting the God who can meet all of our needs.
So certainly a common thread, often looking at these scholars, is opposing drunkenness, be sober-minded. And I want to draw attention to someone, Dr. Todd Miles. He wrote a book, Cannabis and the Christian, What the Bible Says of Marijuana. And I believe he rightly identifies marijuana and alcohol are very different substances in significant ways. And he argues you shouldn't just simply substitute wherever alcohol or drunkenness is in the Bible and simply just substitute for a drug like marijuana. But he does go on to say this, and I'll highlight what he says in his book. It says, God forbids drunkenness because it diminishes physical control, it diminishes our cognitive abilities, and it diminishes our judgment. A THC high does all three of those things. We don't have to make the case to replace all references to alcohol with pot and just read the prohibitions off. I think we can make a more rigorous case and say, why is drunkenness wrong? And what we find is the same things happen when a person is high on THC. I can point, recently there was the state of Florida, for instance, had a ballot initiative that failed. It didn't enact the recreational use of marijuana for the state of Florida. And Governor Ron DeSantis was opposed to it. There were a variety of organizations, law enforcement. One was the Florida Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I thought it was helpful even just to point what they said. In terms of preventing increased use, legalizing marijuana makes it more accessible, removes the criminal penalties and stigma attributed to it, and creates the impression that it is safe to use. Taken together, these factors ultimately lead to increased use of the drug. Again, if understanding today's high-potency marijuana, there are significant health risks, as I've talked about. And I would submit, if we love our neighbor, we should not want to see an increase in youth use, an increase in more families being destroyed by marijuana's impact, mental health, driving, all these things we're seeing in states experimenting with marijuana legalization. And I'll leave with this thought from Joe Carter of the Gospel Coalition, who wrote, I believe many Christians who are concerned with loving their neighbor will change their opinion based on the evidence. If we truly seek the welfare of the city where God has sent us into exile, we'll continue to oppose the legalization and normalization of this drug. I'll leave with this. Certainly want to engage upon some questions. There's certainly multifaceted areas when it comes to this policy discussion. But one to keep in mind is this list. There's a reason why many of these organizations are opposed to the legalization of marijuana for recreational use. They may have things on the medical side. There may be decriminalization efforts that they support. But there's all kinds of reasons highlighting what today's marijuana is doing in states experimenting that is giving them reason to say we should oppose this. So from law enforcement, healthcare, even the Lancaster newspaper editorial board, recognizing many of these harms. I pointed to, in Washington state, the Seattle Times has written numerously in regards to high potency marijuana and what that is causing, the super potent pot that they're seeing, and trying to call out. We're starting to see more reporting being done the more that evidence has caught up. This is somewhat a recent phenomenon when it comes to legalization, when you look at the eons of history. And yes, marijuana has been around, but the super potent pot, as the Seattle Times points out, and the really health implications of such, it's something very recent. Information is starting to catch up. We're seeing in Canada. I just read Argentina is pulling their medical dispensary permits because they're seeing the rise in potency and the harm that it's causing. We're starting to understand that, hey, this high potency marijuana is causing significant problems. Commercialization is making that worse. So with that, we can certainly dive into a...
Let's give Dan a round of applause. So Dan, so many issues there, so many facets we can dive into. Before we jump into our Q&A, I wanted to ask a few probing questions and maybe dive a little bit deeper. But I guess we'll start big picture, right? When we look at the drug issues facing our community, right? Whether it be fentanyl being trafficked, methamphetamines trank on the streets of Kensington, one kind of has to wonder, why focus on marijuana? Why is this an issue? Why should we as Christians or just as citizens be concerned about this issue when there's so many others out there? So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a fair question. There we go. Can you hear me now? Maybe. There we go. All right. It's certainly a fair question. And what initially actually came to mind when you mentioned Kensington, I had a discussion at our youth conference that we put on this past summer with Pastor Bradley Stahl. He's the pastor for Teen Challenge in Pennsylvania. And they have made it a mission of theirs going into Kensington. I commend their efforts. They are going right into the epicenter of really the nation when it comes to drug abuse and the just atrocities that drug use has had on people. And you know, they bring in kind of a van, they have a treatment facility that they ask if they need help, if they would like to you know, kind of clean up themselves. And in asking him this question, he absolutely is opposed to the legalization of marijuana. The more drugs that are out there, it just increases this dependency on those drugs. And again, there's a right nature of looking at what particularly the high potency marijuana is doing. So I think when we look at society, I don't think we are a better state, a better country with more drug use. Again, you pointed the Denver, the restaurant, again, employees seeing what addiction is causing, and a lot of it is because of drug use. And I'd point to the state of Oregon, like, where do we draw the line when it comes? Yes, there's certainly the issues that fentanyl and the opioid crisis. I'm not saying that is not a problem and that we should prioritize marijuana over some of those other drugs. But I think our mindset shouldn't be, let's just decriminalize and increase access to all of these drugs. Because again, some of that experiment that we've seen has not worked out very well. And so it's not an experiment that I think we should delve into right now.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we saw a different opinion on that. Just a few weeks ago, as you mentioned, Governor Josh Shapiro making this recreational legalization a top priority in his budget address. And he phrased this as a choice. We have a choice. He said we have a choice between continuing the black market of drug dealing versus a highly regulated industry with protections in place for our children. Letting this business operate in the shadows, it just doesn't make sense. And by doing nothing, we're making Pennsylvania less competitive. Does the governor have a point here? Is regulation a better way to protect our kids than not?
Well, I think there's a lot there. I'd say, saying less competitive, again, it's not recognizing, frankly, the harms of today's high potency THC. And I think there needs to be a better recognition. I'd say what the governor was saying there really is a false dichotomy. Either we have the illicit market or we have a safe product. And that's just not the case. All these states that have legalized marijuana, the black market continues to thrive. California, there's more black market than legal dispensaries. New York is awful in terms of the rollout that they did. There's so much illicit market. There's always going to be really a desire to have a cheaper product. Governor Shapiro wants a 20% tax. Obviously, that's going to raise the cost of that marijuana. There's always going to be people saying, hey, I can save some dollars from a guy that I've been buying this off of. That's always going to be the case. And so this idea, there's been lawmakers that have said, we'll eradicate the black market if we pass this. No state's done that. The black market's thriving. So we shouldn't have a decision that says, hey, let's increase the black market. Well, again, it's still doing that with legalization, or have a safe product. It's, again, Kate Appleman, I've been on a few debates with, those that are seeing firsthand, that are having to deal with somebody that's being psychotic with regards to high potency marijuana use. It's recognizing that that's harmful and it's harming more kids. My heart bleeds for the Representative Amabile. Her son is destroyed. Our family is broken, as she said. I mean, she has to now live that the rest of her life. And it's because of the high potency being in a market. And frankly, I'll even say it's because of some of the medical use. Again, what was in the New York Times article, we highlight how medical was trying to help these patients, but so many of these companies saw an opportunity to say, hey, we can make higher THC, give a stronger high, and we'll be able to charge more. That was the motivation by many of these companies. So I don't see it as more competitive. I see you're allowing the industry to infiltrate our state, use billboards and social media ads and all of this to influence more use of this drug that they can profit from. That's a conflict of interest that I don't want to see unleashed in our state. So again, I think it's a false dichotomy. I think if you look at those, what SAMHSA said, having medical, non-medical, decriminalization, illegal, I think that's a better use of that. We can look at improvements in different areas without having to go the commercialization route.
Yeah, absolutely. One final question from me before we jump into audience questions. You mentioned the industry infiltrating Harrisburg. We know the governor is very supportive of legalizing, but you're on the ground in Harrisburg every day working on this issue. Can you give us a sense of where we're at right now with marijuana legalization? What are the actors? Who are the main players? What should we expect? And from a perspective opposing recreational legalization, do we have any hope?
Well, I'd say we absolutely have hope. I was told last legislative session that's a done deal. Well, not one vote happened on a marijuana legalization bill. So we do have it's not a ballot initiative in the state, so I know other states have done it differently, but it's going through elected officials. And I think an important observation in this discussion, Pennsylvania, when we passed medical in the state, I've heard from state lawmakers, many that did vote yes, it was because of families bringing in their son that might have been suffering from epilepsy or some kind of condition, and the use of marijuana was helping them. And I think when it comes to that, again, I think our program here in Pennsylvania needs fixing. If there's a drug that doctors can prescribe that can truly help someone, let's study that. Let's allow that to happen for maybe a family. But it's a totally different ballgame when it comes to the recreational use. And I think an observation is what happens at the Capitol. Again, there was families bringing in their children to advocate for, we need medical use. What I see now in Pennsylvania at the Capitol are men in suits that are paid for by the industry lobbying lawmakers. Or I was at a rally and someone that literally had a hat made of marijuana plants to lobby, and it kind of looked like a college party. That's a lot of what is happening in the Capitol. To lobby for, so you can kind of see who's going to profit. We wanted to help people with medical. Well, now who are we trying to help? And it looks like it's a lot of the industry that we're trying to pump up. And I would submit that is not someone that should be our priority. Our priority, especially when it comes to healthcare, the public health and safety of the citizens of your state. If you look at that through that lens, you should be running from this. And that's, again, why all these organizations oppose the legalization, because they see what commercialization does. So again, look at the lobbyists, follow the money, and it's often pointing at these big corporations that want to make a lot of money off of more addictive use of this drug.
Yeah, so many issues. We want to open up to get your questions. We have some IFF fellows walking around. If you have a question, please raise your hand. They'll be over.
So I am from Colorado, and I work on a street with 1 golden arch and 3 green crosses. And I remember when Colorado was beautiful, and now it is so problematic. But I've heard a lot of people say that the reason that Colorado had such a worse time with marijuana is because it was one of the first to legalize it. And so it was this novelty, and people descended on Colorado to smoke it. And I'm wondering what your response would be to that, if Pennsylvania will still have the same problems.
It's a great question. Maybe you can come more to stay in Pennsylvania, I'd say, or something. But no, seriously, I think because we've seen many of the other states, California again, there is so much from a black market perspective, even with regards to legalization. They kind of use that as a shade to what their operations are doing, and so. Sadly, we do see in this nation, we have a few dozen states that are experimenting with this now. And so we can see some of the data. And again, I think we're playing catch up. A lot of this was, hey, we're going to do this, and okay, we'll see what happens. And I was doing this debate for our organization 6-7 years ago. And at that time, really kind of a concluding thought was, we need to learn more. We should push pause and learn more. And I think where we are today, that still is the case, but we have learned a lot. You look at studies in Canada, you look at, again, areas even like Colorado, Washington State, the study that they did. They're recognizing the harm, particularly of the high potency. And we are seeing some of the evidence. We are seeing more studies. Again, you just turn on the news, CNN, Fox News, they're covering a lot of these new studies and showing the long-term effects are starting to come more at play. Just the cognitive, impacts of more daily use, how that's impacting your brain and memory. There's more understanding as your brain develops through age 25 that the use of this, particularly at a younger age, the addiction levels. So sadly, we are seeing more of that. If you work in an ER unit in some of these states, they're seeing it. More exposure to young kids, even the exposure. We see these states having an escalation in the amount of young children, 5 and under, that are coming into hospitals because they ingested edibles. So I guess I think that used to be really a conversation, and some people still certainly highlight that, saying, oh, well, they were one of the first. Well, we have so many other states that are experimenting with this. Let's look at what we're seeing. And again, I think there's solid evidence showing a lot of these types of harms that we've been talking about. So I'd like to say we should learn from Colorado, but again, at Colorado, what I point to, magic mushrooms. Again, where do we stop? And again, I would say the experiment that Oregon did in terms of decriminalizing all drugs was a disaster. And so where do we have that line? Where's the harm, element? And again, I just point to the high potency that we're seeing. There's a doctor, Rav Eifker from Colorado, that early on in their legalization efforts pointed out we need to cap the potency. I think it was at 15%, because he recognizes, yes, there's a lot of harm that we're seeing in where this is going. And so even early on, there were warning signs. But again, I think sadly, since other states have done this, there is starting to be more and more data that's showing this is actually problematic. So, but good question.
Other questions?
On the whole, has the push for legalization pressured Republican lawmakers into some libertarian compromises, or has it elicited a stronger opposition?
I'd say it depends on who you're talking to, and I guess depending on what is that compromise. Almost I'd follow up is, where do we see, is it on the medical use? Is it on the ability to have it if you need it from a health perspective? I guess somewhat that would be my follow up, is knowing like what do you mean from a compromise? I think when it comes to what we're seeing with commercialization, if you open up the door to say, okay, you can use this from a recreational standpoint, so often that is now, okay, industry can come in and the billboards and everything. There is a proposal in Pennsylvania to use the state store model. So the Liquor Control Board being in charge of, putting out this drug. And I'd say Liquor Control Board doesn't want to see that. I'd say it also underscores the marijuana industry doesn't want to see that, because they feel like they're not going to get their piece of the pie. So I mean, there are some different proposals being debated about, but I guess I'd underscore that when it comes to recreational use, what we see in so many of these other states, it's essentially allowing the industry to profit off of these addictive drugs. So I caution against some of, maybe the compromises, because ultimately if we're allowing the industry to unleash their products, I think it's going to harm, Pennsylvanians. And it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. It's harming everybody in that vein. So I just, the caution there. And I think lawmakers, again, there hasn't been a vote here in Pennsylvania. I think, again, underscoring the need to highlight many of these stories of the moms, the parents that are finding out what the impact is of high potency THC. I think more and more need to hold that type of view.
I think we had one down front maybe, and then one over there.
Testing. So I have two questions somewhat related to each other. For the category of marijuana-related crime, is that where, Jen shoots Bob and then she has marijuana on her and then that counts as a marijuana-related crime? How many cases, what's the percentage of marijuana-related crime that's actually just, someone committing a crime, but there's marijuana on that person at the time? And so that's my concern with the statistics. The second question is that I would ask you, is the market more efficient at weeding out bad product than the police power of the state? So that's basically my questions.
I'd say certainly the level of impairment is oftentimes subjective. And so the need when it comes to crime, were they actively, under the influence of THC, is oftentimes an issue. And, that's why I appreciate like Dr. Tom Copeland. I recommend looking at the report that they gave. They did some extensive study, and it's somewhat how it's reported, how the crimes come up, maybe some of the charges that are made. There is some variance at play, certainly when it comes to, okay, did crime increase? But again, I think we look at an example like the Denver, like restaurant owners are seeing impacts of this drug on the streets. And so I think there is a need to underscore what we're seeing in some of these states just regarding just looking at the addiction levels, looking at healthcare, and I think crime can be a part of that. How we classify, there might be individual cases that maybe are different. And I submit too, again, Judge Cheryl Allen is a former Superior Court judge. She's on our team at Pennsylvania Family Institute of Counsel, and she's spoken out a lot in terms of, she had decades of experience with youth coming in particular, but those that had faced a crime and kind of figuring out how to sentence somebody or what happened, with regards to their situation. And I think we want to show compassion, and I think even she would suggest there can be things like having an initial crime, making it a summary offense. Kind of this idea, we don't want to just send people to jail for having a small amount of marijuana on them, but it's also recognizing the harm that marijuana does. And I think what she often says is we shouldn't, correct a harm with another harm. So I think there are efforts that we can improve the criminal justice system and how we classify different crimes. But I think we are seeing with the mental health impact in particular, I think crime is impacted. So I'm going to forget maybe the second part of the question. You could just...
Thank you. I'll try to rephrase. Is the market or the police power of the state more effective at eliminating bad product that people don't want?
I think it underscores what kind of the black market. There's an idea that, okay, if a product is laced with vitamin E or some type of issue using it that's going to cause a problem, we need to have a safe product. And that's why we need legalization. That's why we need almost the market to take place. I'd underscore, again, I think there's an understanding that's needed to say today's marijuana is causing significant harm, even from a legalized recreational use store that's legalized in different states. And through, again, that lens is what we need. I talk with, sadly too many, different officials that, kind of have an 80s mentality or a 90s mentality of what the marijuana use is doing, the impact that it has. And so I think there's a need more to educate, I guess, out there. I would not trust the market to have my interests in mind. You look at big tobacco and what happened and ravaging so many families with regards to their addictive products. And big tobacco is a very much player in the marijuana industry. And I'm sorry, but oftentimes it's profits over people. That's what was shown with the industry of selling nicotine. And sadly, many of those same players and that same mentality can be with the marijuana industry. So I don't want to trust an industry that has a more addictive priority and profiting off of that to have my best interest in mind.
I think we had one final question up here.
Do you foresee a political and legislative comeback in the long run, say like several decades, like a century? And if so, how would we achieve that? Would it be more macro, or would it be more down like individual organizations, peoples, churches, towns, or would it be more of like a federal like counteraction?
My initial answer is yes. I think there's a lot that needs to be done. I'd underscore kind of from a Christian perspective what John Piper said again. The church really hasn't had to deal with this, and I think there are many that have just kind of viewed, well, I might not do it, or some that I did it when I was in college and I was fine. This is okay. And I think our mindset needs to change. And so how we do that is going to be multifaceted. There's going to be a need for, politicians kind of speaking into it and changes in laws. There's going to be a need, laws certainly speak into the culture, but also we need more pastors. We need more those that are in addiction treatment areas speaking out, talking about the reality that what we see. I do appreciate, those clips that I used are from, really just news. I never thought I'd be highlighting Dr. Phil as much with that. But I do appreciate that he is just trying to highlight, here's what people are seeing with this drug. I think there's value in that. It's not necessarily saying, hey, you shouldn't do this. It's, hey, look at the impact this is having. Maybe we should rethink this. Maybe we should look at different policies. So I guess there's a lot, I think, to unpack with how we proceed from here. I guess, the lesson for Pennsylvania is certainly looking at the real evidence in these other states. And even though there's neighboring states doing this, the rollout that we're seeing, again, the pumpkin carving using Disney characters, that was from New Jersey. That's what we're going to start seeing here in Pennsylvania more and more of. The tobacco industry knew that they needed the young users. The same is with marijuana. High Times reported cannabis is the next new thing. Their eyes are set on this. And so I think we need to do more exposure on the reality of today's marijuana, getting people to know the real impacts that we're seeing. And it's going to take some time, but it's a worthwhile investment.
One closing question from me, since I can. This is such a complicated issue. There's so much information to learn. And where do we go to find, where can we go to follow you? Where can we go to find more information on this subject, reliable sources, not just, clickbaity news? Where do we go to find that information?
Yeah, thanks. No, great question. Certainly, if you're from Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania Family Institute, we're doing what we can to really highlight a lot of the realities and truth behind this issue. Our website's pafamily.org. We also have the truthonweed.com resource, really just trying to highlight, again, a lot of the facts and figures that we see in states legalizing. So you can go to that resource. There's certainly some others. Again, I mentioned Luke Niforatos. Smart Approaches to Marijuana is probably the biggest player when it comes to states pushing back on this. It's learnaboutsam.org, I believe, is their website. Again, it's look at some of these health organizations. I'm not running from facts. I'm trying to use even sources that, no matter where you are in the political sphere, SAMHSA, CDC, American Medical Association, some of these that, some people might have bones to pick with some of them, but where can we find information? Okay, let's look at some of those resources. And again, they're highlighting just the reality that they're seeing with regards, particularly the high potency. And so I'm not running from those facts. So it's using some of those resources. I'd point Smart Approaches to Marijuana and then Pennsylvania Family Institute, particularly for those here in Pennsylvania.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan. Let's give Dan a round of applause. Thank you all for coming out. As you leave, we have some resources. Dan has some resources by the door, but have a good night and stay warm.